I remember that shortly after the Star Wars Expanded Universe was decanonized in 2014, a lot of people supported this, saying this was the only decision that Lucasfilm could have made. They had to reboot the continuity with a film that wasn't part of the EU's timeline, because it was the only way a sequel trilogy would make any sense to the casual moviegoer crowd. I suppose there may have been a certain logic to that at the beginning, though I would have argued that Episode 7 taking place within the expanded universe would make perfect sense. Have it take place after the Crucible novel, maybe around 50 years after the Battle of Yavin, and gradually introduce the characters that EU fans have known for years to new audiences. Would it feel a little exposition heavy in a few places? Sure, maybe a little bit, but it's been decades since the last film. I mean, it's better to do that than not give the proper context to how the galaxy has changed over time and just leave it all a mystery. I think it would be fair to assume that a lot has happened over the course of several years. Just like in real life, people change over time, meet new friends, have children, get married, and even experience the pain of losing loved ones. If Episode 7 were to fall in line with the continuity of the EU, I think that would be the biggest hurdle that you would face in writing it. But I believe it could have been done. You can make references to the past, but as long as you're focused on moving the story forward, first and foremost, you can provide audiences with enough information to keep them engaged without having to give them a history lesson of every single thing that's happened in the past 50 years, and introduce characters like Ben Skywalker and Jaina Solo to casual fans for them to fall in love with just like we did. Honestly, Episode 7 tying into the EU would have made for a fantastic movie. However, this article titled Rise of Skywalker shows Star Wars Old EU would have been a terrible movie disagrees with my opinion. It's on ScreenRant.com and is written by Krishan Baker. A link to it will be in the description. This article was brought to my attention by Lethal Lightning, who made a video on it as well, and I'll leave a link in the description for that. The article opens with the tagline, "The Rise of Skywalker used several tropes common to the Star Wars Expanded Universe, proving once and for all that the EU wouldn't work on screen." And we can already start seeing some problems, because Krishan mixes up ideas with the execution of said ideas. Maybe Rise of Skywalker did use several tropes that also appears in the expanded universe, but I believe that weird or uncommon ideas can be pulled off in a story with proper writing. In the first line of the article, Krishan writes, "Last year, Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker was a relatively middling end to an already mixed sequel trilogy. But if it showed us one thing, it's that a straight adaptation of the EU would not have been a good thing." Now here's the issue. The sequel trilogy was not a straight adaptation of the EU. In fact, the EU was discontinued and set aside by Disney and Lucasfilm so the sequel trilogy could be made. And look how well that turned out. Krishan admits the sequels were a mixed bag, and that the final movie was middling. In my experience, that seems to largely be the consensus with these sequels. Do you think that maybe, just maybe, adapting the EU as Episode 7 could have been a better idea? It doesn't seem like it would have been any worse than what we got. Krishan continues. Despite some powerful performances by the central cast, the last film in the Skywalker saga was heavily criticized for a plot that felt more like a video game fetch quest than an engaging story, as well as relying too heavily on perceived fan service. The final result was a movie that leaves more questions than answers, lots of which have been resolved in supplemental material and additional reading that leaves the movie feeling more like a homework assignment. You can only make so many excuses or deflections like saying, the EU would have been worse, before just coming to the main problems of this thing. It's the writing and the direction. J.J. Abrams didn't have to make his film a video game fetch quest. He didn't have to rely on fan service as a crutch. He didn't have to make the finale ask more questions to be resolved in other material. So why even talk about adapting the EU being a bad thing, when The Rise of Skywalker is dealing with much bigger issues? But I do have to give Krishan credit for at least recognizing the value of the EU. He writes, "Conversely, the Star Wars EU felt like the exact opposite of homework. Back in the dark ages of the Star Wars content drought, 1985 to 1991, The formation of the extended universe was like a breath of life for fans. What started out as two major projects that continued the story of Leia, Han, and Luke quickly escalated into a living, breathing web of storytelling that fleshed out never-before-seen corners of the Star Wars universe. Not only were fans finding out what happened to their favorite characters post-Return of the Jedi, but they were also discovering information about the origins of the Sith and the many intergalactic wars that ravaged the galaxy. I agree with everything Krishan said in this paragraph. So much so that I'm a little perplexed. Because you see everything the EU has to offer, and you don't want that expanded upon in a movie? You just said Rise of Skywalker is a middling video game fetch quest. You'll have to forgive me, but between that and the EU, I'll take the living, breathing web of storytelling any day. Krishan continues. When Disney decanonized the EU, technically it was never actually canon in the first place, back in 2014, many fans saw this as a slight against the legacy of the expanded universe and all the stories provided by it. However, after seeing The Rise of Skywalker, it's evident that a straight adaptation of the EU would never have been as good as Star Wars fans assume. First off, the EU was canon, and we have quotes from Lucasfilm employees to prove it. That's why Leland Chee and Pablo Hidalgo's job was to make sure it all fit. If none of it was canon, they wouldn't have to do that. And that's why we have the hierarchy of canon. That's why when material like Star Wars Tales or Infinities comes out, they specify that that stuff is what really is non-canon. That's why even though you contradicted yourself in the first sentence of this paragraph, you still had to say, Disney decanonized the EU. Because that's exactly what they did. And yeah, many fans did see that as a slight. I sort of viewed it as Disney and Lucasfilm treating their once loyalist fans as used toilet paper. Though I definitely took more issue with the EU being discontinued, rather than decanonized. If the EU can still have material added to it, while not being part of the current Disney canon, then so much the better. I'm perfectly happy with my non-canon alternate universe. I'll take that and be on my way. But anyway, enlighten me. Why does seeing Rise of Skywalker make you think that a straight EU adaptation wouldn't work? For starters, one of the major problems with The Rise of Skywalker was just how hard the movie leaned into the expected fan conventions. With the mixed reception to The Last Jedi's subversive narrative and challenging character writing, a vocal faction of the fanbase demanded a return to form for Disney Star Wars films, rather than stick to their guns and go with another equally challenging film, something Colin Trevorrow's original Episode 9 script attempted to do so. Disney and J.J. Abrams instead doubled down on fan service to widen the movie's appeal. Okay, so The Last Jedi tried to subvert expectations and didn't work. Then J.J. Abrams came back and tried to play it safe like he did with TFA, and it fell flat on its face. What does that have to do with the EU again? However, a lot of the movie's fan service is merely plot devices repurposed from the EU, such as Palpatine's return and his usage of cloning. While there are several plot elements in the sequel trilogy that are borrowed from the EU, The Rise of Skywalker leans into it the heaviest. By simply reusing those plot points on screen, audiences can see just how implausible some of the writing in the EU truly was. The expanded universe lasted for over 20 years, and in that time, fans got to experience a lot of great material, but also a lot of ridiculous and unnecessary material as well. Okay, so you say The Rise of Skywalker constantly borrows plot devices from the EU, but the only example you have is Palpatine returning as a clone, which, sure, did happen in the EU, but the storyline was still very different for The Rise of Skywalker than it was in the Dark Empire comics. And I would argue Dark Empire did a far better job with its story and writing. The thing is that Rise of Skywalker isn't a movie adaptation of Dark Empire. If it was, and the movie wasn't very good, then maybe I could see your point about how the EU wouldn't work on screen. But the problem with Rise of Skywalker isn't actually Palpatine coming back. Back when the first trailer came out, a lot of people were actually really excited to see Palpatine return. And with a competent writer, you could have done that. Rise of Skywalker wasn't hampered by the implausible writing of the EU. It was hampered by a writer/director who struggled with creativity and vision. And by the way, if you want proof of not just the EU working on screen, but of the Dark Empire storyline, check out Wilkins Animations on YouTube. They combine the 1994 Dark Empire audio drama with gorgeous animation that mimics Cam Kennedy's art style perfectly. There's only one episode so far, but I hope they make more soon. And judging by the reactions in the comment section, many people seem to prefer this 12-minute video over the entire sequel trilogy. If you want to watch it, there will definitely be a link in the description. Krishan continues. Of course, in the format of a constantly expanding literary universe, that kind of absurdity is given a pass. For every story about Chewbacca running into Indiana Jones, the EU also gave us classic titles like Heir to the Empire and the Jedi Academy series. As a whole, it's difficult to call the entirety of the expanded universe objectively good or bad. Just expansive. So his example of a bad EU story, with Chewbacca running into Indiana Jones, is called Into the Great Unknown. It's actually from Star Wars Tales, much of which was non-canon and made for fun. Obviously, this story is non-canon, because it contradicts the larger expanded universe, and shouldn't actually be taken seriously. Someday, all these article writers who want to bash the EU will realize what Star Wars Tales actually is about. Someday. But at least he acknowledges there are classics in the EU, like Heir to the Empire and the Jedi Academy trilogy. But Krishan's last sentence here is very confusing to me. Yes, it's difficult to call the EU all objectively good or bad, because there are many stories of varying quality. I agree, but in that same regard, I think it's also difficult to objectively say the EU wouldn't work on screen, and only citing a similar plot point that appeared in the EU being used in a poorly written Disney canon movie as evidence. In fact, I would be very embarrassed to make that claim. It'd be like saying, this movie about a dragon was not very good, so therefore any movie involving dragons would not work on screen. Krishan concludes by saying, it's easier to sift through the bad when there's a wealth of content to plumb through, and there's a chance you might stumble upon a diamond. However, as the Star Wars Rise of Skywalker showed us, the kind of storytelling that was prevalent in the expanded universe worked because of the medium that the EU was being told in. And even though it was a difficult choice, Disney made the right one in not adapting the expanded universe into new canon, and starting over from the ground up instead. Yeah, this article was very confused, and not very good. I mean, he's saying The Rise of Skywalker was bad, the sequel trilogy was very mixed, and the EU was great, so many fans loved it, and it was a great web of storytelling, but Disney made the right choice in not adapting the EU, and making the sequels, even though they suck. If they adapted the EU, it wouldn't work, but they didn't adapt the EU, and it didn't work, but it's still the EU's fault that it didn't work. Okay. Anyway, go check out Dark Empire Episode 1 on Wilkins Animations' YouTube channel. It's literally the expanded universe adapted on screen. And unlike some other things, it works very well.